Welcome to our Intelex community webinar, ISO 45001, What Will It Mean to You and Your Business? I'm here with Chris Ward today. Hi, Chris. How are you?
Okay, Tamara. Very good, thank you.
I'm Tamara Paris, your Intelex community manager. And Chris Ward is an Intelex community member, and he's going to be sharing his knowledge and his expertise on the topic of ISO 45001. Chris is retired from the Health and Safety Executive, where he was the principal inspector. Currently, he is a committee member of the BSI 18001. In our Intelex community, Chris owns one of our groups. It's the ISO 45001 group. Joining Chris today is his good friend Jane Sanderwick, and she's the managing director at Sanderwick Safety Partnership. She's also one of Intelex community's ISO experts. Welcome, Jane.
Thanks, Tamara. It's good to be here.
I'm glad you're here. And we also have with us Eric Morris. He's the manager of health and safety practices here at Intelex, and he is one of our in-house ISO experts. Welcome, Eric.
Hi, thank you, Tamara.
Thank you, Chris and Jane and Eric, for your time, for joining us today and sharing your knowledge with the Intelex and EHS professional members who are also joining us here today. I'm going to now pass the webinar over to Chris Ward.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you, Tamara, for making this opportunity for us to talk to all the attendees on the proposed standard ISO 45001. I want to begin by giving a brief history of the two standards, 18001 and ISO 45001. By way of background, as Tamara said, I worked for the Health and Safety Executive for almost 40 years. During that time, I was an inspector and principal inspector and looking and inspecting a wide range of industries and service in sector. The latter part of my career, I specialized in occupational health and safety management systems, and one of the last things I did in the Health and Safety Executive in the UK was to revise their well-known health and safety management system, HSG 65. Interestingly, the first edition of that was produced in the early 1990s, and that stimulated the creation of 18001 in the late 90s, and that was further revised in 2007. I revised HSG 65 in 2013 when it was published, and at about that time the ISO, the International Standards Organization, had popular support to produce a standard which went further than 18001. And so this new standard is more ambitious and requires more from organizations than 18001 did previously. Let's have a look at some of the differences. I'm going to briefly headline those differences, and later on Jane and Eric, and then I will discuss them in some more detail. So with clause 5.1, which is about leadership and commitment, this is slightly different to 18001 in terms of the top management, which is defined as those who direct and control an organization, will have to demonstrate leadership and commitment. Previously, in 18001, the leadership only had to provide for a policy, a safety policy, and authorize it. There was not this same emphasis as there is now, as there will be, on demonstrating that commitment. An interesting definition of top management is it means the top controlling mind of a particular organization. So if an organization has several divisions, the top management is, for the time being, the top management of that division. So if you're a global organization with different divisions in different countries, top management is present in that particular division in that country. The other area, second area of change from 18,001 is that of worker involvement. And interestingly, again, there's a new definition of worker, and worker in this new standard includes all levels of management. So that's the top management, middle management, and non-managerial staff. And the ambition in this standard is to have much more active worker involvement. An area that Jane will talk about in a few moments is risks and opportunities. And the standard is aiming to have continuous improvement and that the opportunities that present themselves and those opportunities which the organisation needs to seek out have to be taken forward and progress made. Continuous improvement isn't continual improvement. It means that the management, top management, have from time to time to review what they're doing in terms of improvement. And a word about risks, which is in this clause here. The risks in this standard have been defined as the effect of uncertainty. An effect is a deviation from the expected, positive or negative, and uncertainty is a state, even partial, or of deficiency of information related to understanding or knowledge of an event, its consequence or likelihood. So slightly different from 18,001. And the context of the organisation is another area of ambitious change. And this is a clause that requires the organisation to obtain an understanding of the issues, either positive or negative, that they need to consider. So the issues of interest, Eric will describe later on, but they can be internal issues or external issues. And this is something more than taking account of what the legal requirements are in the particular place that the organisation is operating. I will now hand back to Tamara. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. We're going to open our ISO 45001 expert discussion now. But before we do that, I'd like to take one moment for you to meet our ISO experts, Jane Sanderwich and Eric Morris, before we start the discussion. Hi, Jane. Welcome.
Thanks, Tamara. I'm going to be talking later about OH&S risk and improving performance using 45001. But before I answer this really good question, I'd like to just introduce myself and explain what I'm bringing to the table. I've worked with Chris Ward on a variety of projects over the last 10 years, and I'm very excited now to be working with him again on the ISO 45001 project. We believe our experience and expert knowledge can really help implement the new standard. My experience provides me with two very different perspectives on the standard. As for part of my working life, I'm a technical specialist assessor for one of the UK's largest certification bodies. I've assessed literally hundreds of organisations against the existing OSAS 18001 standard. For the other part of my working life, this is where I provide consultancy and training support for companies looking to improve the way they manage health and safety, and also quality and environmental management systems. I'll hand back over to Tamara now. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane, for that introduction. And now I'd like to take a moment. Eric Morris, can you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, thank you, Tamara. This is Eric. I'm the manager of the health and safety practice at Intelex, and it's my responsibility to manage the product portfolio around safety, as well as the content that flows into our system. Back to you, Tamara.
Thank you, Eric. And now I'm going to pass the presentation back to Chris Ward. And if you'd start off our discussions, Chris, that'd be great.
Thank you, Tamara. I'm going to talk for a few moments now about leadership, their commitment and the barriers to success. See, the fundamental philosophy of the new standard is that the role of leadership is to take overall responsibility and accountability for the protection of the workers, their health and their safety. And don't forget that the worker includes the top man, the CEO and the main directors. In order to achieve this, those in authority must ensure that the occupational safety policy and related objectives established are compatible with the strategic direction of the organisation, together with the integration of the management systems, processes and requirements into the organisation's business processes. So it's something more than just having a separate health and safety system. It has to be integrated. Central to the application of the standard will be the need to provide and ensure that the resources needed to establish, implement, maintain and improve the management system are available. Here again is the demonstration that leaders have to commit, and they're showing it here by providing the resources. How often do we see empty statements? Statements of safety is our number one priority, but the money and resources aren't put into it. There needs to be a clear structure of communication from top management to the shop floor, and that must be put in place in order to emphasize the importance of effective management and of conforming to the management system requirements. This can take the form of committees, delegated representatives or toolbox talks, something from the formal to the informal. Now these structures must ensure that the management system achieves its intended outcome. So again, it's not a question of providing empty structures that don't actually do anything or achieve anything. These intended outcomes include and will be achieved by directing and supporting persons to contribute to the effectiveness of the management system. Again, this is how leadership can show their commitment by actively providing that support to workers, for instance, by acting quickly on complaints, by acting quickly when an incident occurs, or investigating accidents, and then feeding back what they find back into the workplace. I'd like to ask Jane here, with her extensive experience of 18,001 auditing, what she has seen in terms of bad practice from leaders in the organisations that she's been to. Jane, over to you.
Yes, thanks, Chris. That's an interesting question. I see lots of different types of organisations, but it's quite noticeable that when I first meet a company to carry out a certification assessment, it's quite noticeable and it makes an impression whether the top management are involved in the assessment process. It's actually fairly common for me to be visiting a company and only dealing at the opening meeting and for the rest of the day just with the health and safety manager. Maybe the top management come briefly to the opening meeting or introduce themselves, but they don't have very much involvement in the process. And it makes a certain impression and tells me something about how they're resourcing and how they're leading the whole exercise, and not always a good impression. Back to you, Chris.
Thank you, Jane. It does strike me, and I do wonder how these leaders with their entrenched negative views will view this new standard. Hopefully there'll be a groundswell of support for the new standard from the suppliers and clients, and that can help influence the leaders, particularly if it means that business is at risk. I'd like to ask Eric what his experience is of leadership, and what good and what bad leadership looks and feels like. Over to you, Eric.
Thanks, Chris. I think, in my opinion, good management is all about creating a risk-averse culture of safety and really pushing this culture from the top down. Once management has bought into the benefits of an effective safety management system, it's really up to them to put into place and develop a fit-for-purpose management system based on the principles of plan, do, check, act, involving all the relevant stakeholders. Some key activities that can be owned by the management team are things like developing a health and safety training program, developing a consistent industrial change management process, regular safety auditing protocols, and even develop an ongoing measurement and feedback system, which looks at leading indicators of safety, such as the number of hazards or near misses reported, or the number of job safety analyses conducted, or the safety checks completed, and so on. And then finally, the management team should never forget to celebrate successes, publicize good safety records, and do their best to share safety practices across all divisions of the organization.
Thank you, Eric. That's very interesting, and I'm sure all the people watching and listening will be wondering what good leadership and bad leadership would look like in their organization. I will now pass over to Jane for her to talk about the risks and opportunities in a little more detail.
Thank you, Chris. So let's go back to the question about improving performance through ISO 45001. As with the other Annex SL-based ISO standards for quality and environmental management, ISO 45001 will provide a systematic framework geared to delivering improved performance. And of course, in the context of occupational health and safety, this also means reduced risk of injury and ill health. A key factor in the risk reduction process is to ensure that it's systematic and proactive. It means gathering a full picture of the risks relevant to the organisation and setting about prioritising these. In order to make this exercise have meaning and value, it is also essential that key members of the workforce are engaged in the process. This is the only way to ensure that all the risks are identified and prioritised accurately, but also it ensures that the control measures that are identified to reduce risk are practical, technically feasible, and will get the support and buy-in from the people actually doing the job. The prioritisation of risk is also critical. I've carried out many certification audits, and the organisations that do well are good at identifying the main risks in the business. If I ask them what the top 5 risks are, the client can easily list these. The assessment of the implemented controls and the work done to reduce these top 5 risks is usually proportionate and effective. These risks usually arise from high consequence and low frequency events, such as large explosions, rail collisions, or major accidents. But organisations should ensure that the low consequence and high frequency risks are just as well managed. It's common to find organisations caught out by incidents at their offices where they perceive risks to be low, whilst they focus on the big issues on the shop floor. The other area where risk reduction is sometimes missed is around occupational health risks. There is much evidence that shows that occupational health risks, such as musculoskeletal disorders, occupational asthma, hand-arm vibration, and dermatitis, cause long-term absences from work, far longer than injuries. These are reversible and can be permanently disabling. And yet organisations miss these as often they are perceived as low risk, and by this they mean low likelihood. Don't forget also that the risk reduction measures for these occupational health risks should include appropriate health surveillance. So these are just a snapshot of the key issues that I've seen in practice and which can be key factors in the work to reduce risk and improve performance. Let me ask Let me ask you a question, Eric. So in multi-division organisations, how will they transfer best practice from one division to another?
Yeah, thank you, Jane, for that. This is frankly why, Jane, organizations like Intelex exist. So historically, safety data and best practices have been handled in more or less a siloed fashion, gathering in a lot of cases digital dust sitting in someone's filing cabinet somewhere at a site. And this is especially true of global organizations whose divisions are separated by time zones and distance. A company like Intelex, we aim to provide a modern, globally accessible, integrated safety data management system that allows transparent and instantaneous access to best practices and data across your organization, regardless of time zone or distance. So, it's in order to share best practice, electronic systems like ours really go a long way. Back to you, Jane.
Oh, thanks, Eric. Thank you. Chris, how about you? What's your experience of risk prioritisation?
Thank you, Jane. Well, I think you've touched on it earlier on. My experience is that quite often organisations, even in high-risk industries, miss the small things, the basic things about getting the job done to a good standard of workmanship. My mind goes to the massive explosion that happened in the UK about 10 years ago now at a place called Buncefield, when some fuel storage tanks overflowed and the vapour cloud blew up. It was the largest explosion in 70 years in Britain. That was all because a fairly inexpensive, couple of £100 or dollars, float valve had not been maintained properly, and as a result of which a tank overflowed and you had this massive explosion. Proper maintenance would have identified that problem. A particular accident I investigated where 200 tons of scaffold collapsed around a building, and that was because the person putting in the anchor bolts with the drill, drilling into the concrete of the building, didn't drill the holes properly, left dust in them, didn't put enough anchor bolts in, and the scaffold, as a result, collapsed in some high winds. Interestingly, in both cases, nobody was hurt. They were incidents and near misses, but a massive cost at Buncefield and a pretty massive fine, because I prosecuted the company, the scaffold collapse. Thank you, Jane.
Thanks, Chris. Those are two really good examples. I'm going to hand over now to Eric. I'm going to pass the mic to you, Eric. Thank you.
Sure. I'd like to also spend a few minutes talking about the context of the organization and what that means for safety management systems as well. What is really interesting for this aspect of the standard is that under the new standard, organizations are really asked to consider both the internal and the external factors that affect their safety management system. This means that organizations will be forced to look vertically and horizontally at the implications of their business and understand the needs and expectations of not just their internal activities, but also those of their business ecosystem, like the relevant regulators or the customers, the shareholders, suppliers, consultants, contractors, and so on. And additionally, they also need to look at the physical ecosystem. So, really understand the health and safety implications of the physical space around them, including the surrounding communities and such. To dive a little bit deeper into a point I made earlier, the intent of the standard is very much in line with some of the major sustainability frameworks as well, like the GRI or the Global Reporting Initiative. And in terms of long-term viability of the organization, under these frameworks, the health and safety system generally doesn't stop at the confines of a building or a factory, but they really go deep into the supply chains. As a result of frameworks like these, companies are now or will be now interested in the health and safety practices of their suppliers and contractors. And indeed, they're more and more interested in working with their suppliers and collaborating vertically to develop safer products, safer practices, and equipment. At the end of the day, it's not just good for business in the long term, but it also helps you by preserving and uplifting your brand. Jane, I'll go to you first. How do organizations address this under 18001?
I think the most common example I've seen here is in the construction sector. where obviously construction companies working together on a large project, they all have to implement equally effective health and safety systems. And what I've seen happening is more and more large organisations, the large construction companies who are in charge and controlling the site, they actually impose really high standards on the small subcontractors that are working for them on the site, even to the point where micro-organisations with less than 5 employees are being pushed to achieve standards even beyond what would be required by legislation, particularly in the UK. So I'm already seeing that stakeholders and supply chain organisations are having to achieve high standards, and I think more and more that will be the norm with 45001, not just in construction.
Great. And I'll ask Chris as well. How are the auditors going to address this point?
Thank you, Eric. Well, to some extent, the existing auditors to 18001 will to consider being retrained to 45001 because the two standards are completely separate organisations. Therefore, there will be a separate organisation, a separate auditing regime, and therefore new training courses and new standards for auditing to 45001. And I understand that ISO is considering a new work program, a new work project to have an international standard for auditing, not just for 45001, but across the board. So we'll see how that transpires and what happens there. But certainly the new auditing courses will be coming online later this year in time for the publication of the standard in October 2016 this year. Okay, thank you, Eric, for that. I will now move on to the next part of the presentation. We've sort of finished our discussion about the standard, and you've heard what we think about how 45001 is going to impact on organisations. We'd like to hear your views, and what we have done is created a survey which will take about 3 minutes or so, probably less, for you to complete. And on this slide you see the address of the survey. When the slideshow comes out to you fairly soon, that link will be live and take you to the survey. What we're going to do with the results is put them through the analysis and evaluation process and send the results back to you, and that will give you the chance of benchmarking yourself against other organisations who've completed this survey. And we'll put the survey out to the much wider community through Intelex, through LinkedIn, and through other organs of publicity, or add value to those results by sending them to ISO and the BSI. A colleague, Christian Gleisel, on the drafting group will be happy to consider them, and we hope to invite him to a further webinar in which we can discuss the results and how ISO is going to help organisations achieve 45001. I'll hand over now to Tamara. Thank you for attending today, and we hope to hear and see you sometime in the future. Thank you very much.
I'd like to take a moment to introduce people to the Intelex community. If you're currently not a member of our community, you can sign up for free by using the sign up button. If you are a member, just click on the login button and you can sign up using your LinkedIn. In order to find Chris Ward's ISO 45001 group, you go to the top of the page. To connect, go down to groups. In our group section, if you scroll down, you'll see the ISO 45001 and click into his group. If you are not a member, click on the red join button that you'll see. And if you are a member, you can scroll down, and right here, Chris has access to the ISO 45001 draft right on his website. So you click into this post, and there is a link that'll take you right to Chris's own site, and you can register to see a copy of the national standard from here. So I'm going to open it up for questions now, and I'll give the presentation back to Chris.
Thank you, Tamara. We have some questions come in. I'll group some of them together so that they make some sort of sense together. One of the popular questions is, what's the biggest difference between 8001 and 45001 in a few words? So I think we've touched on that. It's going to be top management commitment, the context of the organization, worker involvement, and continuous improvement. But also there's a change to the documents that need to be kept. In 18001 was a lot of documentation requirements, and quite specific. 45001 is going to require documented information, and this can be in the form of certainly written communication. It can be in the form of memos and emails or videos. It doesn't have to be a written bespoke document in the traditional sense of the word. So that gives more flexibility, particularly for SMEs, for smaller organizations. And we've just time for one final question, but a really important one, and that is, will there be any guidelines to implement 45001 in the same way that there was with 18001? That had, as you remember, 18002 and 18004. No, the ISO is not producing any guidelines for implementation. There will be an annex, which I've seen, and you'll probably be able to see if you look at the draft standard. That annex is the guidance, and it's very, very limited. It's just a few words of explanation of definitions, almost a repeat of the clauses. So what Jane and I and Intelex through Tamara has decided to do is to run these webinars to gather your, as practitioners for the 45001, and your organizations will also need some guidance. We're going to gather the problems that you see, the challenges and your solutions, not only through the survey, but through the Intelex community and through LinkedIn. Gather those ideas together, and then Jane and I will draft some guidelines and be able to send them out through the communities to help organizations and yourselves implement. We've got experience with this before. Jane and I have worked on some HSE guidance together for SMEs about 12 years ago now, and of course I revised HSG 65, which was based on surveys of practitioners and of organizations trying to implement the Health and Safety at Work Act in Britain. So we think we're well placed to produce that sort of guidance, and that will help fill the vacuum that inevitably there will be. Jane, I think it's worthwhile, if you can, to add something to that, to get your views, because like many of these areas, you bring a tremendous experience and current experience of auditing to 18001.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yes, I think what's obvious at this stage is that nobody's actually got any experience of working with 45001. We've all got this exposure to the printed documents, the draft standards that's been evolving. But over the next couple of years, The community that we're working with is going to build this experience base. And what Chris and I are hoping to do is to pull all that together, to collate that and share it back through the Intelex and the LinkedIn communities with companies that are looking to learn from others to fast track their way through to compliance with the standard. And so that's where we see our role over the next couple of years.
Thank you, Jane. Tamara, I'll hand back to you now to do the final wrap-up.
Thank you, Jane and Eric, for partaking in our webinar today, and Chris Ward for all your effort and time working on this project with me to do this webinar. I'd like to again, invite people to please participate in our ISO 45001 survey, because what we'll be doing is we'll be collecting the information and the feedback that everybody provides in the survey so that we can take the results and use it to develop a practical guidance for the implementation of the standards for you, your company, and professionals to be using as a tool to help implement it. And I'd really like to encourage everybody to please join us on the Intelex community on the EHS LinkedIn group so that we can work as a community to understand the standard together and share our resources. Thank you again, Jane, Eric, and Chris, for your time, and thank you very much for Intelex and EHS professional members for joining us today, and we hope that we see you on the Intelex community.